Hey class, welcome back to Intro Psych. We're covering the King text using the King text, moving from chapter 9 and into chapter 10. We're talking about the subject of personality theory in this chapter. So this one, we'll be dividing it up by looking at several theories of personality, attempting to explain various aspects of personality, including psychodynamic, humanistic, trait, social cog, and the biological perspective. And then we'll end the chapter by looking at how do we assess, how do we measure, how do we test this construct of personality. So one of the old, we're going to be talking about several different theories of personality, and we'll start with Freudian theory, but it's important to at least sort of set the table for what's to come when we talk about personality, which is a pretty abstract concept in psychology. A construct that is, the definition is evolving. It's very nuanced. Each theory kind of presents a different perspective on how to think about personality, but really what we're talking about is an enduring, distinctive pattern of the way people think, the way they feel, and the way they respond or act within the world. And if we think about individual differences, human beings, at least on a biological level, are so extremely similar. We're all like 99.99, who knows, whatever the number is, it's very high, nearly 100% similar, but yet we're all very unique as individuals. And I think personality, at least from psychology, personality is, kind of pointing at those differences. Intelligence is one thing, problem solving, but I think personality is another important way we can conceptualize differences. So the first perspective we're looking at comes from Freud. Anytime you see psychodynamic, you can kind of mentally replace that with Freudian perspectives or any way you want to think about it. But the idea is that our personality is shaped by unconscious forces, unconscious behavior and forces in the way we think that's kind of below the surface, influencing the way we think and behave. And so what we're talking about is lack of awareness. In this sense, this is lack of awareness due to fear, typically from some sort of childhood experience, perhaps. So a lot of things go back to childhood. Almost everything points to unconscious wishes and desires when it comes to explaining phenomena from a psychodynamic perspective. Everything sort of has symbolic meaning, which is, pointing to explaining these underlying behaviors. Like, for example, Freud talked about like Freudian slips. When you say something one way when you intended to say it another way. And supposedly that is symbolic of a potential conflict underneath the surface. So again, everything about this theory also points back to childhood matters a lot. If psychodynamic theory gets one thing right, it is childhood matters a lot, especially when it comes to trying to understand and explain individual differences in personality formation. So Freud, again, the founder of psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theory, according to Freud, the sex drive is sort of the main determinant of personality. But when it's important to point out that, when Freud uses the word sex, he's not always limiting it to the physical act of sexual reproduction, for example. I mean, sex drive can really be the release of any energy. And perhaps one of the most powerful methods by which human beings release energy, of course, is sex. But I mean, that he sort of defines it in a much more broader term than we might sort of conceptualize it nowadays. Freud used personality theory, specifically these unconscious forces developing early in life, to try to explain phenomena, specifically things like hysteria, where individuals experience physical symptoms without physical causes, going blind without any sort of physical damage to the eyes, an arm or a limb that stops working for no physical reason. And he's using personality theory to try to understand why these things are happening. There might be psychological causes, unconscious conflict below the surface that's influencing our physical health, psychological health influencing physical health. Freud divided up personality into three unique structures. You have the id, which is the first part of our personality that develops according to Freud. It is the pleasure principle. I want this and I want it now. It relies on instincts and those reservoirs of sexual energy, the libido that Freud talks about a lot. Again, it's the pleasure principle. I want something, I want it now. So like if your personality was only made up of the id, and if you went to a restaurant and you were hungry, you would not wait to be seated. You wouldn't wait for the waiter or the server to come, take your order. You might just start grabbing stuff as you see it and shoving it in your mouth, and having no concern whatsoever for any kind of social norms. You want food and you want it now. The ego is more about the reality principle, understanding that, okay, I might be hungry, but there's a time and a place for this. Like when if I go to a restaurant and I want to eat, I have to wait for the hostess to seat the host or the hostess to seat us. I have to wait for the server to come take our order. I have to wait for the kitchen to finish our meal, all of these steps. And so instead of just, reaching off your neighbor's plate or reaching off to another, table and grabbing food, you realize, okay, I need to wait if I ever want to come back to this restaurant again or with the people I'm with, probably should wait. And this, of course, develops with time. Eventually, you also have the development of the superego, and it's a sense of our morality. It's our sense of conscience, our sense of right and right. Essentially, the id and the ego are kind of butting heads. The superego is almost like the ref in between that decides, okay, which course of action would be moral, which would be right or wrong. And this is obviously it has strong influence by the way we're raised in childhood. So again, Freud also talked about personality, as a metaphor, as the iceberg. And if you've heard the saying about icebergs, that there's much more below the surface. So according to Freud, our conscious experience of the things that are happening right here now, this is the surface. This is the stuff that we can see, but there's a lot of stuff below the surface, according to Freud, that has a profound impact on our behavior, on our way of thinking, on our personality. You have the id, the ego, and the superego kind of operating below the surface, some of it conscious, but most of it not. And according to Freud, this is a huge predictor or determinant of behavior. And so we're experiencing conflict. According to Freud, especially during childhood, there's lots of conflict, especially when we talk about the id, the ego, the superego kind of butting heads, kind of figuring out, and if those conflicts aren't resolved, we experience, stress, we experience anxiety. And as a way to kind of cope with stress, a way to cope with anxiety, we engage in defense mechanisms, things that we might do unconsciously without even meaning to. And a lot of this, comes from the work of Freud's own daughter, Anna Freud, who was a neo-Freudian, followed in the footsteps of her father. But the idea is we use these defense mechanisms kind of as a way to psychologically insulate ourselves by reducing anxiety, distorting reality, perhaps unconsciously, as a way to make ourselves feel better. Some of these strategies would probably be considered psychologically unhealthy, but not necessarily all of them are unhealthy. And there might be a kind of time and place for some of these, but generally speaking, we're talking about things that responding in ways that you may not even realize you're doing this. So sometimes it can be healthy, sometimes it can be unhealthy. One of those might be denial, just simply disbelieve present reality. For example, if you went to the doctor and you were given some kind of diagnoses like, oh, you have some kind of cancer, some kind of illness, and you might just deny that. You might flat out, as a way to kind of protect yourself from the anxiety of that situation, the stress, you might just say, oh no, my doctor's wrong. Maybe they got the tests wrong. They'll get the results back eventually and realize they're wrong. Sometimes disbelief is beneficial. If somebody tells you can't do something and you don't believe them, and you use that as motivation, that could be fine. That's maybe a defense mechanism. That's fine. But if you are disbelieving things about your own health, for example, if you don't believe your doctor who says you have cancer and you act like you don't do any kind of preventative steps or take any medicine, then that obviously would be a problem. Displacement is where we shift feelings from a new target. Maybe you're angry at your boss at work, but probably can't do anything about it at work, otherwise you'd lose your job. So maybe you go home and you yell at the neighbor kids who are too loud. You're normally you're fine with them making noise and playing, but today, because you're so angry at your boss, you displace that anger to somebody else in a more so appropriate way. sublimation, transforming something vile into something valuable. We have projection, attributing faults to others. So, like, oh my gosh, if you were cheating on your spouse, but then you accuse them of cheating on you, it's like, okay, you're projecting your own guilt. Reaction formation, experiencing the opposite of actual desires. Repression, this is where you start to push unacceptable impulses out of awareness, like your thoughts or feelings, maybe you're repressing certain memories. There's also regression, regressing to another age, a lower age. But Freud talked about personality developing in stages. And these stages typically are, from birth to adolescence is where most of our personality is formed. And each stage is centered around what Freud called an erogenous zone, where we are focusing a lot of our energy. So for example, the first stage is called the oral stage, first year and a half of life, roughly. And it makes a lot of sense why it's called this, because primarily pleasure is derived around the mouth for children. Babies, when they're born, if you give them any kind of object, the first thing they do is they pop it in their mouth. They're exploring the world through their mouth. I mean, they're feeding through their mouth. So life is literally sustained that way. They're exploring the world that way. So a lot of focus is very much on the mouth at this stage. Second stage is called anal stage, roughly a year and a half to 2 to 3 years old. This is where we're talking about children who are learning. Their primary energy focus is around their bowels, their ability to go to the bathroom by themselves, to function, to eliminate waste by themselves. Maybe that involves potty training. These are really important moments, figuring out, how do I go to the bathroom by myself? The phallic stage, 3 to 6 years old. This is children at this point kind of discovered that, oh, like I have genitals and I'm a boy or I'm a girl. They start to develop some of those gender identity aspects, and they engage in sort of non-sexual masturbation, which really is just like, oh, if I'm a boy, like, oh, I have a penis, and okay, that's what's going on down there. It's it's kind of weird to say that kids that young are engaging in masturbating, but then they're not doing it in a way that maybe like teenagers, adults associate it, but they're basically just exploring their bodies and figuring out, oh, like I'm an individual now, and with a body, and this is the early stages of my gender identity. And for boys, they might, or for females, according to Freud, they might develop what's called an Oedipus complex, where they are in love with their opposite sex parent, and a fear of rejection from their same sex parents. So obviously not a lot of scientific proof for this particular aspect of the theory, but it's an interesting addition. And boys suffer sort of the opposite, the castration complex, or castration anxiety, excuse me. And according to Freud, girls at this stage, when they discover that they are girls and don't have a penis, they develop penis envy, which, say that out loud nowadays, sounds pretty sexist and doesn't exactly hold a lot of water. But again, we're just kind of presenting Freudian theory as it was stated. The last stage, or second to last stage, sorry, I said 4, it's actually 5 stages. You have the latency stage, and this is where that psychic energy kind of goes into timeout. This is where you start focusing on peer relationships. Early years of school, for example, sexual interest is repressed. It doesn't come back again until adolescence, adulthood, when individuals enter what is called the genital stage. And at this point, instead of being kind of concerned about your own genitals, at this point, you start to become concerned about the genitals of other people. You experience a sexual reawakening. This is puberty. This is when individuals start to reach sexual maturation. And the idea is that you derive pleasure from somebody else as opposed to yourself. So according to Freud, too, thinking about each of these stages, individuals can become fixated if they do not resolve conflict at each of these stages. Somebody in the second stage, if they don't resolve conflict in the anal stage, they could be anal retentive, anal repulsive, which tends to manifest itself in a number of behaviors potentially. So here's what this might look like. So if you were in the oral stage and the individual got fixated or stuck at this stage, they might develop habits like smoking, biting their nails, things like that. And that might look like defense mechanisms like sublimation, seeking knowledge, humor, wit, sarcasm, being a wine expert, reaction formation, somebody who's a speech purist, prohibitionist, things like that. And you can go through the chart and look at each one of these. But according to Freud, if we get stuck, kind of fixated at any one of these stages, it has some, pretty interesting consequences to the way we think, the way we behave, the way our personality operates. Okay, so some sort of modern approaches or more kind of, some perspectives about psychodynamic theory from others besides Freud. We have Karen Horney, who talked about, both sexes have envy of attributes of the other. It's not just women who have penis envy towards men. She also talked about security as a primary motivator and not just sex, not just that release of energy. So there's some agreements with Freud, but some disagreements as well. You also have Carl Jung, who talked about not only the individual conscious, but the collective unconscious that human beings collectively share just by being part of the human experience, how we develop what are called sort of archetypes, personality types, that you can read about the different ones: anima, animus, persona, things like that. Alfred Adler, another follower of Freud, talked about perfection, not pleasure, as the key motivator to moving through and developing personality. We try to compensate, for example, and in order not to feel inferior. And a lot of, Freud talked about childhood experiences matter, but Alfred Adler took it one step further and talked about not only does childhood matter, but let's say you live in a family of like four, the birth order matters too. If you're the youngest, you might have a very different childhood experience than somebody who grows up as the first child, or maybe those middle two children might have very different experiences. So again, childhood matters, but maybe a little more nuance to that. So evaluating this theory, it's a really popular theory in terms of historical understanding of personality, really stresses the importance of childhood experiences. We really, this idea that development happens in stages is very, unique. It's takes a lot of shape from Freud. Individuals will have experiences that are transformative, and providing them meaning as they develop. The role of the unconscious mind is important as well. Conflicts about inner and outer worlds, personality and adjustment. These are, Freud was one of the first people to talk about that in terms of being able to study psychologically. So a lot of important things there, but, Freud, obviously not a perfect theory. Most theories are not all theories are not perfect, but Freud especially is open to criticism. Probably place too much emphasis on early experiences. Early experiences in life matter, but individuals we know can change, they can adapt, they can grow. Probably put too much faith in unconscious mind in terms of controlling behavior, too much emphasis on sex. A lot of these ideas are difficult, if not impossible, to study empirically. So, the scientific aspects of this theory leave much to be desired. So that's one perspective. The next is humanistic, which is, humanistic, anytime you hear that term, we're going to think of individuals like Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, and really focusing on the positive aspects of human qualities, that individuals are capable of growth. Individuals are, capable of exerting free will over their lives and making choices and making good choices for that matter. So that's the crux of this theory. Freud was all about the unconscious. This is very much about conscious experiences that we have direct control over. So almost the antithesis to Freudian theory. We have Maslow. We've talked about Maslow before. The goal of the hierarchy of needs is to achieve self-actualization. We're seeking out peak experiences to reach that, self-actualization, reach our best version. However, a lot of Maslow's theory is interesting, but kind of like Freud, we can kind of punch some holes through it. His examples of self-actualized individuals were pretty biased. Mostly he looked at historical figures, Mother Teresa, Abraham Lincoln, Mahatma Gandhi, people like that. And it's, if you're just kind of cherry picking people that you think kind of embody this theory, you can cherry pick the ones that meet your theory and exclude everyone else. And, if you're doing that, of course you're right. But on further, inspection, there's some problems with that. Carl Rogers, another follower of the humanistic perspective, talked about, our personality is a combination of the raw ingredients, like the DNA we're born with, but it's also some kind of combination of the environmental conditions. So it's nature and nurture. It's embracing both aspects of development. And we are motivated. Our personality is geared towards growth and self-determination, making choices. And we can do that when we exist and live, in conditions where we are given unconditional positive regard, meaning people show us love and consideration and compassion, even when we make mistakes. Our conditions of worth are not determined by, conditional conditional positive regard, meaning our parents don't stop loving us because, oh, you made a bad grade on this test. Your parents love you either way. So a big focus on the self, big role on being, helping people grow through empathy, through genuineness. So this theory has made a lot of contributions. Self-perception, being aware, being self-aware is very important to understanding personality theory. It's a very optimistic, positive approach to understanding the whole person. And instead of being, very opposite of Freud, instead of focusing on unconscious experiences, the focus here is on conscious, experiences that are happening right here and now. The criticisms, perhaps too, humanistic individual personality theorists are maybe too optimistic about human nature, overestimate the freedom and rationality of human behavior. And some have even accused, this kind of perspective of promoting self-love that borderlines, being narcissistic, and not holding individuals accountable for their behavior. We just give everybody unconditional positive regard, even, people who make mistakes like committing crimes and things like that. And again, I don't think that's necessarily the end all be all of being compassionate to all people, but I can understand why that might rub some people the wrong way. Trait perspective is probably one of the more nuanced, one of the more modern understandings of personality theory. It's the idea that our personality is shaped by traits, characteristics or dispositions in terms of how we respond. These are pretty stable characteristics that are, across time and place, meaning, for example, one of the traits we'll look at is extroversion. If you are an extrovert now, you're probably going to be an extrovert 10 years from now, and you probably were 10 years, prior. So these are fairly stable characteristics. There are a few different theories trying to explain personality through traits. Basically, the idea is that we can describe people based on their typical behavior, based on these collection of traits. So, we might look at traits in terms of strong versus weak tendencies. Gordon Allport is one of the first theorists addressing this, and each individual has a unique capacity to adapt to the world around them, and really talked about trying to understand personality through the traits that allow us to adapt. And those traits, are behaviors that are consistent across situations. And really, he talked about 4,500 different traits. It really wasn't until W.T. Norman came around and broke that down into kind of 5 factors, which gives us the 5-factor model of personality. I don't love this first one. It's like NEOAC or ocean. You can either spell it as canoe or ocean, in my opinion, but the big 5 are openness to experience. Conscientiousness. So how organized, disorganized are you? Extroversion, where do you derive your energy from? Agreeableness, like how well do you get along with others? And neuroticism, in terms of the stability of your emotions. So again, if you want to, you can rearrange these to spell either ocean, or you can rearrange it another way and they spell canoe. And these are the big 5 personality traits. And typically a lot of personality tests will be tapping into this model of personality to try to understand differences in personality. So again, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. Those are the big 5. And those are, probably our best understanding of personality currently. Do these show up in assessment of personality across cultures around the world? A lot of research shows yes. Yeah, these things show up. There's a pretty strong correlation now. It maybe not the exact same expression across time, across culture in different places, but we do see a pretty strong correlation. Same thing with animals. Do the big 5 personality traits show up in animals, especially animals that are more likely to spend time with humans, like dogs? Again, we do see a pretty good amount of correlation there. So this is a really good theory that's held up pretty well, maybe better so than the couple of theories we've talked about before. So thinking about some of those traits, specifically neuroticism and extroversion, and how those relate to well-being, when we think about why people are happy, life events such as if you win the lottery, if people win the lottery and yet, acquire a lot of money, and it's not like all of a sudden they become happy, they become just immediately happy overnight. Maybe they're temporarily happy, but there's some personality traits that are more consistently associated with happiness and well-being. For example, being high in extroversion, scoring low in neuroticism. Those people tend to score higher in terms of levels of well-being and happiness. The subjective sense of well-being, your own assessment of how well you're doing, how well your life is going. And those traits tend to be, pretty enduring. They tend to be enduring characteristics compared to, states where they're just brief experiences. For example, being an introvert tends to be a trait rather than being a state. But obviously, there are examples where individuals maybe have to embrace those kind of different personality types in different settings. For the most part, I'm an introvert, but when I have to teach in front of a class, I have to be more outgoing. I have to be more sociable. I have to be more willing to derive energy from social situations. So, my default trait is usually introversion, but right now I would say, I'm more embracing the aspects of extroversion during this, this particular time. So let's evaluate this. Lots of contributions here. They allow us to understand people better. Especially we have these factors to kind of think about human behavior. It gives us a better understanding of the connections between personality, health. How these traits influence, relationships, health, career, all of those things. Criticisms, though, it doesn't really take into account situational factors. It also ignores nuances of individuals, their personality. Again, if you're just kind of lumping everything together into like 5 buckets and everybody kind of fits into that, I mean, there's going to be probably some individuals who might fall through the cracks in that explanation. We also have social cognitive perspective. And the idea is, not only we have conscious awareness, but it's about our beliefs, it's about our expectations, and the goals that we set are a big influence on our personality. And this perspective is influenced by behaviorism, Skinner, people we've talked about before. And this is getting into, things like being able to reason, thinking about past, future self, reflecting on the self, all of these things, and really how our behavior is, it changes to diverse situations, how it is shaped and influenced by different situations. So this perspective is like the opposite of the last one we talked about. The situation is key. If we want to understand why somebody acts the way we do, then we need to understand the power of the situation. So this perspective is influenced by Albert Bandura, who talked about the importance of observational learning, which we talked about in, I believe, chapter 5, exerting control, how much control we have, how self-efficacious we feel, how capable we feel about any given task or goal we're attempting to set, and reciprocal determinism, meaning our personality is influenced by a number of factors: cognitive factors, situational factors, behavioral factors. It's not one or the other. It's really a biopsychosocial phenomenon. Behavior, environment, cognition, the situation, those things are what create personality. Those are the things that influence personality. So this is kind of a chart showing reciprocal determinism. If we're trying to understand why a person is the way they are from a personality standpoint, we need to observe their behavior, look at what they're doing, think about any situational factors, also any cognitive or person factors as well. And that's really how we can get a more nuanced understanding of their personality. Walter Mischel, also another social cognitive theorist, talked about situationism, the power of the situation, meaning our personality, the way we behave, the way we think, can be shaped across different contexts. It's not whether personality predicts behavior, but when and how it does. So what situations evoke certain, behavioral responses. One of the famous studies of this is looking at the marshmallow study, and how individuals can delay their gratification. It's really interesting, if you put a marshmallow in front of a child like this, and you say, hey, I'm going to leave the room for a few minutes. And if you don't eat this marshmallow now, if you wait until the time I come back, you'll get a second marshmallow. You'll get 2 instead of 1. And the idea is we can study how they delay their gratification, which kids are willing to delay gratification, which aren't. And, it's correlation research. We have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt, but this research showed that the individuals who, when they track these individuals years down the line, they found out that the kids who were able to delay their gratification had more kind of life success. They were better, had better, more stable relationships. They were more likely to graduate and have better grades and all of these other life outcomes. So, the situation matters. The situation really, context matters a lot. And so this is also looking at the CAPS model of personality, how our personality is it stable over time rather than across different situations, and the interconnections between emotions, cognitions, and how those affect behavior. Again, that reciprocal determinism chart we saw a couple slides ago. So this theory is important, obviously highlights the observation of behavior and the importance there, emphasizes the influence of cognitive processes and also the environment and how individuals can control or exert will over their environment and what that effect has on personality. Criticisms, perhaps maybe too concerned with the situation. It's pretty specific in terms of predictions, and also ignores the role of biology, which takes us to our last theory before we get into personality testing. That is biological perspectives, looking at how personality is influenced by the structures of the brain. For example, damage can alter personality to the brain. Brain activity in certain areas of the brain is correlated with different aspects of personality. And an individual, Henry Eynsink, I think it's Harry or Henry, sorry if I'm butchering that, talked about the reticular activation system theory and how extroverts and introverts have different levels of arousal, and that reticular activation system in the midbrain, we can actually see in terms of brain arousal activity that extroverts and introverts are on a different kind of level. So pointing to some physical explanations as well, also related to blood flow, dopamine levels. So definitely something going on there. So when we think about, the activation system, this theory in terms of introversion, extroversion, so introverts tend to be more quiet and reserved versus extroverts who are outgoing. The level of arousal for introverts tends to be above, extroverts tends to be below. So the kind of activities they might engage in, introverts might keep distractions to a minimum. They might enjoy more time alone, specifically reading, whereas extroverts might seek out certain distractions, want to spend more time with their friends, and they might want to do things that aren't necessarily quiet. Maybe it's listening to music. Maybe it's, lots of loud conversations with friends and family. But we can point to actual brain activities going on there. So some other theories related to biological perspective is Gray's reinforcement sensitivity theory. We have either the behavioral activation system or the behavioral inhibition system. So we kind of have both. Some are, if you're using the BAS, it's sensitive to environmental rewards. The BIS, sensitive to environmental punishment. BAS, seeking out positive consequences. BIS, avoiding negative consequences. So very different kind of systems happening, but depending on the circumstance, depending on the situation, we might use one or the other or both. What about neurotransmitters? The neurotransmitters, the language that our brain speaks in. Neuroticism, for example, has been linked to lots of activity in the amygdala, low levels of serotonin, and poor regulation of the HPA, otherwise known as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That is a mouthful. So we can point to specific areas of the brain, specific functions of the brain, specific chemicals of the brain to understand personality. It gives us a better understanding. We also see dopamine and serotonin being linked to openness to experience. Neural connections in the brain are also involved in thinking about other people, lead to oxytocin, serotonin, which is connected back to agreeableness. And we also see, for example, that greater brain volume, specifically in the areas of attention, being able to control impulses and behavior, being able to plan. We're talking about the frontal lobe here. This is correlating with conscientiousness. Okay, so we're also kind of thinking about this. If biology can be used to explain aspects of personality, well, that might mean that aspects of our personality are are heritable, meaning we can share them via genetics. We can pass them down. And there's really interesting research from behavioral genetics. For example, twin studies have shown that there's a huge genetic influence on the big five traits. About 50% can be explained in terms of genetic influence. When we talk about these traits, though, it's not like there's like a single extrovert trait or a single, gene for extroversion or neuroticism. In fact, those traits are probably going to be influenced by multiple genes. So it's a polygenetic phenomenon in this case. So evaluating this perspective, it really looks at, learning principles, brain imaging, evolutionary theory to explain personality. But really it's getting into correlation causation. Biology in this case may be the effect, not the cause of personality. We don't know which way it goes. We know there's a relationship there, but we don't quite know for sure yet. So last thing we're going to look at is how do we assess personality? How do we measure this construct called personality? One way to do it are self-report tests, where you might read a list of questions. You might read a list of statements like, I like to watch TV at night before I go to bed. I subscribe to magazines for enjoyment. I mean, you just answer random questions like that. You'll answer typically true, false, things like that. And how you respond, how you self-report, tends to be a reflection of your personality. But obviously some people, might answer in ways that aren't always honest. They might answer in ways that are more socially desirable. And so really, trying to find tests that get around that, to ask questions that don't kind of tip people off and how they think they should respond. So finding test items, for example, that aren't necessarily obviously related to the purpose of the test. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory is an example of one that does this. Here's an example of that. Controls for social desirability. It can be used to assess mental health. It's also used for hiring decisions, criminal risk, things like that. You also have the neuroticism, extroversion, openness personality inventory. It assesses 5 factors and 6 subdimensions. It has been measured for face validity, meaning this test kind of meets the criteria of it. It definitely looks like it measures these constructs. However, there have been challenges to the accuracy of participants' responses. Another way we can measure personality is through projective tests, where the individual projects their personality onto the instrument. It is very much based around psychodynamic theory, Freudian theory. The idea is that you project your own meaning or understanding on ambiguous stimuli, such as the Rorschach ink blot test depicted here. You look at an ink blot, and depending on whatever comes to mind, you say that, and you're kind of scored based on your response. However, this kind of assessment leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to constructs like reliability and validity. Reliability meaning consistency in measurement, validity meaning are we measuring what we mean to measure. These things are not the most scientifically accurate measures of personality. So you also have the TAT, the thematic apperception test, where you look at a picture like this and basically tell a story about what you see here. And depending on the story you tell, that's supposed to be a window into your unconscious mind. Tell us about, what your thinking and behaving really is. So, all right. Other methods, obviously, for personality, behavioral observations, cognitive assessments, things like that, peer ratings, psychophysiological measures, brain imaging. I mean, so there's not a singular way to measure personality, but those are some of the more popular methods. So anyways, that's going to do it for chapter 10. We'll pick back up with chapter 11 next time. Let me know if you have any questions, drop them in the chat, drop them in the comment section, and I'll try to answer those as I can. Take care. Bye.